All right. So just to recap, I started the recording a couple minutes late. We're getting into our lecture about what blood sugar is and why it's important. Excuse me. These are kind of some of the things that we're going to be covering. And we'll start by just talking about really what blood sugar is so you guys can wrap your mind around it, and then what role insulin plays in this. So easiest way to simplify it is that anytime you eat something with carbohydrates, or overt sugar, a sugary thing, but even things like sweet potatoes that have complex carbohydrates, your body breaks this down into single molecules. And those single molecules are these little red glucose molecules. Whether you're eating a cake from a bakery or a sweet potato or a donut you bought on the corner at the corner shop when you're getting your coffee, the body's digestive enzymes are going to break all of that up, and what you're going to end up with is these teeny little glucose molecules. Yes, you might have some fats in there, or some protein as well in some of these things. But as far as the carbohydrates get broken down, they get broken down into glucose and sometimes fructose too, but we're going to focus on glucose because that's really what we're measuring when we're looking at your blood sugar. So you eat this sugary or carby meal, breaks down to glucose, and then this glucose is absorbed through your digestive tract. And there is a very tightly regulated intersection between your digestive tract, so whether that's your small intestine or even your stomach, your large intestine, and your bloodstream. Your bloodstream basically lives on the outside of your digestive tract, and there's teeny little holes that allow things like the glucose to be sucked out of the bloodstream where we don't want it to be for too long, out of the digestive tract into the bloodstream. Then it can travel anywhere it needs to go in the body. And the biggest users of glucose are skeletal muscle, so any muscle that you have on your body, and then your brain. Those suck up glucose, use it for energy, use it for brain power, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to use those kind of as the examples when I'm talking about it, but almost all your cells do use some sort of glucose. So the muscle and the brain are just very easy to picture because we know that we need to be using our brain 24/7 and we need to use our muscles to move. And so that's just where the bulk of the glucose goes after we eat it. So it moves from the digestive system into the bloodstream, but then again, we don't want it to be hanging out in the bloodstream for too long. That's literally what diabetes is, having high blood sugars inside your blood vessels all the time. So we have to produce insulin. Insulin is produced by the pancreas, and insulin is kind of like the key in this situation. Every cell has a glucose channel, which you can see here, but the glucose can't get in there until insulin accompanies it, turns the key and tells the cell, hey, the glucose is coming in, and then the cell will allow it to go in there. So insulin is just as important as the glucose, because if you don't have insulin, for example, people who have type 1 diabetes, their body does not produce insulin. So they have to inject themselves with insulin every single time they eat, or else all that glucose stays in their bloodstream and doesn't get to any of their cells. People with late onset type 2 diabetes, which is typically what accompanies metabolic syndrome and obesity, and occurs, oftentimes later in life. Most of them are producing insulin, but they're actually producing too much insulin, as opposed to type 1 diabetics who can't produce any. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I just like this picture because remember, all of your cells need to use glucose, especially your skeletal muscles and your brain cells. And eating the glucose isn't good enough. You have to have an appropriate insulin response from a healthy pancreas that allows that glucose to enter those cells to give us energy and to give us brain power. I've been holding on to this little graph for quite a while. I don't even remember where I found it. Unfortunately, I can't cite the source, but I think it is a good visual without being too detailed about optimal and dysregulated glucose. So this orangish pink sign is the unhealthy glucose response. The bottom axis is time since meal. So, starting all the way on the left-hand side is when you're eating your meal, your blood sugar is pretty stable. And that dotted line is kind of your starting point and your ending point. That's where your body's really happy. So when you eat something, yes, it is normal for your blood glucose to rise. Obviously, your body's digesting it. It's getting mobilized into the bloodstream. However, you don't want it to stay too high for too long. First of all, you don't want it to go too high. You don't want it to stay high for too long. And you want it to easily normalize in a very steady manner. So let's look at this orangish pink one, which is the unhealthy glucose response. You eat something at time 0 on the left-hand side, your blood glucose starts to rise, rises quite higher than it really should, because if you're looking at the dark blue one, that's the healthy response. Yeah, it rises, but not nearly as high. It's a much smoother bump, we could say, than this super high orange one. In addition to that, because the glucose gets so high, the body releases a lot of insulin to compensate and suck up that glucose and get it into the cells. And then what happens? You tank. You go very far down, even past that dotted baseline, and you become a little hypoglycemic because your body overproduced insulin, and then you have to go up again before you normalize. So not everyone's doing that every single time they eat, even if they have unregulated blood sugar, but we don't want any of that to happen. We want to make sure that the area under that curve is smaller and we're not having a huge spike. Like that spike is twice as high as the blue one. But then we also want to make sure that the time and the curve of us getting back to that dotted line baseline is more smooth and isn't jaggedy or isn't going below and then above again and then normalizing. So yes, your blood sugar is not going to be that dotted line all day. If you eat and you're a human, if you walk and you exercise, do anything that affects glucose stores or the intake of glucose, yes, you're going to have ebbs and flows, but it shouldn't be spikes and valleys. Okay. Any questions about anything so far? Okay. I like this page because I think that it gives a good broad picture of how many things that blood sugar can affect. So if your blood sugar is not stable, you might be one of those people who feels hungry all the time, no matter if you just ate. And we'll talk about why that might be. What about food comas? You eat your dinner and then you need to go like lay down for 30 minutes, or you can't be bothered because you're literally just need to digest your food. That's a sign that your blood sugar is probably going high and then low. Fatigue and brain fog, if you're dealing with those peaks and valleys of the highs and lows of blood sugar, then your brain is not going to be functioning as optimally, and you're going to be tired and you're going to have some lack of mental clarity or some brain fog there. The next one people actually do think about quite frequently when they're thinking about low blood sugar, might get that lightheaded or dizzy feeling, or even like notice that you're visibly shaking before a meal, like you need to eat. On the opposite side of that, people might feel super energized right after they eat, but then their energy tanks. And that's a sign that you're having that spike. You're feeling good for a second, but then it's plummeting after that. Some patients with blood sugar instability will report intense sugar and caffeine cravings. And oftentimes that's just to cover up low blood sugar, right? Like, what is going to be a Band-Aid so that I can get through the day? Oh, a little caffeine will keep me going, or, you know, some sort of really sugary, carby thing will rise my blood sugar instantaneously. Yeah, well, then 15 minutes later, you're tanked again. So that's your body trying to tell you that I have unbalanced blood sugar, not necessarily to cover it up with caffeine or intense sugar, but that's oftentimes what's easily available, and that's what people do. This one hits home for me, unexplained moodiness or feeling hangry. If my blood sugar gets low, I definitely get the hangry feeling. You know, some people feel more anxious. I just like can't do anything until I eat. My brain does not work, and you don't want to be around me if that's happening. Regarding sleep, you know, you have a little bit of fluctuation in your blood sugar while you're sleeping. And it tends to go a little bit lower because you haven't eaten, you know, you're fasting naturally overnight. But if it's tanking or you're having really highs and really low lows, that will wake you up from a sleep, or it will prevent you from getting adequate deep sleep. I've even had patients, and I think this is on here lower on, night sweats and even day sweats. Sometimes when people's blood sugar tanks, they'll feel like almost like they're having a hot flash, but it's really just from sugar. And so that's something to investigate too. Obviously, we look at everyone's hormones and we want to make sure that that's not contributing, but sometimes it's as simple as blood sugar. Recurrent yeast and fungal infections are also very common with blood sugar issues. And that's because high levels of blood sugar feed the yeast and allow it to more robust. And so some patients will have, it doesn't have to be just vaginal yeast infection. Some people will have more like topical skin itchiness and infections and things like that. I have a lot of patients who they thought that they came in with like dandruff on their scalp. And once we fix blood sugar stability, they no longer have like the flakiness and kind of the more fungal overgrowth situation that causes a little bit of flakiness on their scalp. So that's one that I typically see that's not necessarily linked to a vaginal yeast infection, which everyone can imagine would also get worse if you're eating high amounts of sugar. Unexplained thirst or frequent urination, that's typically once you're already starting to trend down the diabetic path. As things are changing, your body is trying to dilute your blood with water, so it tells you you're thirsty. And then it's trying to get rid of excess sugars in your urine, so you have to pee all the time. And then high blood sugar, because high blood pressure, because anytime you're adding a solute or any sort of molecule to a cup of water, that increases the pressure that's in there. Your blood vessels are only so big. So if you keep adding more junk into it or sugar, that's just causing the pressure and putting wear and tear on your blood vessels. High blood pressure usually goes hand in hand with diabetes too. And it's really unfortunate that both high blood sugar and high blood pressure are kind of like very silent until it's almost too late. I don't want to scare you, but in conventional medicine, a lot of people don't know, or if they don't go to the doctor, they go to the doctor because all of a sudden they feel really bad. But really that stuff's been happening for a decade. And if they would have gone to the doctor and checked it, they could have reversed it or done some things in the meantime to make that better. Okay. I'm just making sure no one else is in the waiting room. All right. I like this quote, and I think that it sums up kind of what we just talked about pretty well. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like we just talked about, there's tons of other symptoms, but we know that repeated high glucose spikes after meals, which usually comes from eating too many carbs or simple carbohydrates and sugar, do contribute to inflammation, blood vessel damage, increased risk of diabetes and weight gain, and I would add cardiovascular disease in here as well. And those are the big players, and I think it's important that people realize that how you're fueling yourself every day and what kind of meals you're having, whether they're blood sugar balanced or not, is affecting all of these things, because no one wants diabetes. No one wants to be gaining unexplained weight. No one wants to be going to the doctor and told that they, are starting to develop cardiovascular disease. And something as simple as paying attention to how we balance these meals and making sure that you're not experiencing these symptoms of high or low blood sugar can make a huge difference. Okay, so this slide, there's a lot going on, but I'm going to explain it. This is telling us more in depth about insulin resistance. So the left-hand side of the screen with the little bubbles is kind of what should normally happen. And I went through this earlier, but I'm going to go through it again because I have the pictures, and then I want to also relate that to insulin resistance. So first thing that happens, you eat a meal with starches and sugars, and your digestive system breaks the carbs down into glucose. Remember, glucose is like the smallest molecule. You have all these long chains and all of this. When it gets broken down by the digestive enzymes in the stomach and the small intestine, it is just that simple glucose molecule. Then through the small little junctions that separate the digestive system from your bloodstream, the glucose passes through there. It is small enough to pass through there. It doesn't need the insulin key there. It just needs it once it gets to the cell. So passes through that little junction, gets into the bloodstream, causes the levels of glucose in your blood to rise, which is normal after you eat. The pancreas senses this high level of blood sugar in the vessels, and so it releases insulin into the bloodstream. Now, remember, insulin's the key, so it allows glucose to exit the bloodstream and enter the muscle and brain cells, thus normalizing blood sugar in the vessels. So really, insulin's just being called upon anytime there's sugar in the bloodstream to take it out of there and to put it in the cells so that we don't have gobs and gobs of glucose running around our bloodstream, because that's very irritating to the blood vessels. Literally, even the sides of your blood vessels, if there's so much sugar in your bloodstream, it will make little micro tears in the bloodstream. A lot of times people with diabetes will have peripheral neuropathy is what they call it, and they might not have as good of nervous sensation in their toes and extremities. So they might not, one of the tests they do for you if you're a legit diabetic is they will like take a Q-tip and have the soft part, and then they'll break it so it's like a little bit of pointy on the other end, and they'll rub it on diabetics' toes and they'll see if they're able to feel it. Well, if your blood sugar has been super high for a super long time and uncontrolled, your teeny little capillary blood vessels and nerves aren't getting enough blood in your toes and your fingers, because that's where everything gets really teeny blood vessel wise, because of those high levels of sugars have destroyed it over time. And then you lose feeling and you lose circulation in those areas. And so it definitely takes a long time to get there. But, you know, even little bits of this system being dysregulated can affect your daily function and your ability to think clearly and all of these things. So that's how it normally happens. Now let's talk a little bit more about insulin resistance. I couldn't find an exact side by side for this, so it's a little bit different looking and there's a little bit extra information, but I'm just going to talk about the high yield stuff. So really what happens with insulin resistance is, number one, patients are eating too much sugar, too much simple carbohydrates, too much glucose. And so too much glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream. Then your body does what it thinks it needs to do, and it produces more and more insulin because it's thinking, how the hell am I going to get all of this sugar into these cells? I'm going to need a lot more insulin because this person just ate an entire birthday cake or whatever that might be that was overdoing it on the sugar. So the pancreas is overworked. It's producing boatloads of insulin. And then all these receptors that are on every single cell, remember the little keyhole that the insulin goes into? Those receptors start to get a little confused. They're like, okay, for 20, 30, 40, 50 years of my life, I only had this much insulin floating around and that took care of everything. Now there's 2, 3, 4 times as much insulin being produced by the pancreas. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to block these receptors. That's what starts insulin resistance. And that means that even if your body is producing more insulin to accommodate the glucose in your bloodstream, even if those two get together, that insulin key does not open the cell. So the insulin and the glucose stay in your bloodstream long-term, causing not good things. So it's an overproduction because of an overabsorption of glucose. Too much eating of the sugar causes too much production of the insulin. And then all of our cells are just confused and they stop being sensitive to that insulin signal because there is so many insulin molecules floating around that they lose their sensitivity. So we don't need to talk about the different proteins that are activated and things like that. But I like this breakdown because just as easy as this can happen, you can reverse it. And going down to paying attention to your carbs and focusing on complex carbohydrates and always pairing that with protein and other things that we're going to talk about in a few slides, that will slowly bring down your insulin levels and that will reverse this. Those cells will become more sensitive to that insulin once there's not so much insulin floating around 24/7. So it is reversible. It just takes, first of all, it takes actually understanding that this is what's going on in your body, if it is, doing the right testing so that you have a baseline and you know what you need to aim for, and then implementing some of this dietary and lifestyle stuff. There's tons of herbs and even medications and things that help support blood sugar. Really today, I just focus on the diet and lifestyle stuff. I'd be so willing to do something in the future that talks more about herbal medicine and things like that. But I just didn't think that I would have time to put it all into one slide set. So maybe I'll do another doc talk on, natural remedies and blood sugar balance. But I think, in my experience, the diet and the lifestyle thing are the low-hanging fruit. Most of them are free. You don't have to pay anything extra to make these little habit changes. And they're more sustainable long-term, because who wants to wake up every day and take pills or capsules or even herbs with every meal? We're going to talk about a couple things that I kind of fall in the realm of herbal medicine, but not like specific herbs. And that's not sustainable long-term either. And a lot of times we are just doing an herbal band-aid instead of a medication band-aid, right? The herb might be keeping your blood sugar more steady, but what happens if you stop the herb? Your blood sugar goes right back up to higher levels. That's not really fixing the problem. We really got to fix it from the dietary perspective and lifestyle perspective. So we'll talk about that. Any questions on insulin resistance? Because I might have explained that in a confusing manner. Okay, how we test. So on all of our standard blood panels, we are testing these 3 markers, which are great baseline markers and a great way to start and be able to see if you need to dig deeper. So we look at your fasting blood glucose, which is literally your glucose at that time in space. It's nothing, a lot of things can affect that. So in conjunction with that fasting blood glucose, which is just an instantaneous reading, we also look at your hemoglobin A1C. Your hemoglobin A1C is a lot more accurate. It's testing the average of the glucose in your red blood cells for the last 3 months. It's a lot more advantageous to use as far as guiding therapy and kind of just knowing if you're actually making these changes, because it's giving a 90-day span as opposed to what your blood sugar is in this exact moment, right? And that's how they actually track true diabetics, is by looking at their hemoglobin A1C. We also look at your insulin, because remember, glucose is just half the picture. Whether you're testing fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C, you're only looking at the sugar levels. You're not looking at the insulin levels, which have a lot to do with this whole situation. So we always check fasting insulin levels as well. And we'll talk about ideal levels for some of these as we go forward. So that's like what you're typically getting when you get your blood drawn and you come and see us and we report your findings of the labs. We're looking at those 3 things. Now, there's a couple other things. Sometimes for some patients, I will prescribe and use a continuous glucose monitor. That is this little picture in the lower right-hand corner. It's this little plastic button that you basically stick into your arm. It does have a needle, but the needle is flexible. Like if you took it off, you could hit it with your finger like this. It's so you don't feel like you have a needle jabbed into your arm. And you keep this on for 2 weeks, and you're able to continuously scan your phone to see what your blood levels are. And this is pretty accurate. I've done it myself. I've done it with a handful of different patients, and I've done it with patients even who don't have blood sugar dysregulation, but they just want to see if any specific foods are really causing dysregulation in their body. So I had one patient who, no matter how much white potatoes she ate, it spiked. Even if she had like a couple of teeny little bites with her steak, which you would think, oh, she's having plenty of fat and protein with the steak. Nope, her blood sugar would spike. If she tried it the next day, just having the steak, it stayed steady, but the slightest amount of white potatoes. And for her, that wasn't a big, huge deal. She wasn't eating a lot of white potatoes anyway, but she just switched to sweet potatoes. But little things like that, you know, don't take a whole lot of work or effort on your part, can be eluded from these tests. And then you can kind of live a life where your blood sugar is more stable and you're aware of specifically how certain foods affect you. Because yeah, white potatoes, we kind of know that that's a higher glycemic food, and that typically would raise people's blood sugar. But I've had other patients who it's more unsuspecting things. And so having a tool like this that you could wear for 14 days at a time and test specific foods that you're eating on a regular basis to see how your body's reacting is kind of cool. And it's not necessary, but I think unless you are having a lot of sugar issues, but I think that more data on the body is always good. And this is something that has so many downstream effects that are unfavorable, that if we can figure this out now, or at least have a window into what's happening on a daily basis, even if you feel like you are eating pretty healthy, maybe your blood sugar isn't responding as so. And maybe you just need to add a little bit of this or that to your diet, and that can kind of correct it. So we'll talk about that too, and some good tools for that in the future. The next one is the finger prick method. That's the above the upper picture. That's where you literally take a little lancet or a little blade and you prick your finger and then you check it. That's checking your blood glucose instantaneously. But again, what's that do? For some people who are diabetic, they like to check it right after they eat, and that can tell them if they need to take extra insulin, if it's too high, things like that. But who wants to prick their finger all the time after every meal and in the morning when they wake up to see what their fasting blood sugar is? No one. So you end up with a bunch of sore fingers and you have to carry this glucometer around. So the continuous glucose monitors have been a nice new thing in the field, and they become a lot more reasonably priced. In the past, it was like thousands of dollars to get one of these if you didn't have a diabetic diagnosis. And a lot of people want to do this before they get diabetes so that they can actually make sure they don't end up diabetic. So the one that I use is, they actually offer the first one for free. They have a 14-day free trial, so you can get one of them. It just has to go to a Walgreens because that's kind of like how the deal is. And then I think it's $75 for one after that. Like if I gave you a refill, you could refill it, and the cash price is $75. So with the free one and then paying for the second one, you could get 4 weeks or a full month of your blood sugar data for $75, which I feel like is pretty good, and not cost prohibitive enough compared to what the glucose monitors used to be. And then we have additional testing. I've only had to do this with a few patients, but you do something called a 2-hour glucose tolerance test. If any of you have been pregnant and done the glucose tolerance test, pretty similar to that. And then I always like to add on 2-hour insulin test too. So if you're going to go there and you're going to get poked twice and they're going to draw a tube of blood, they might as well also look at your insulin, what it is fasting. And then after you have approximately 100 grams of sugar. When you're pregnant, they make you drink the Glucola drink or whatever that has the perfect amount of sugar in it. Really, the research has shown as long as you eat 100 grams of sugar, you can eat whatever you want, whether that's fruit, toast, whatever it is that gets you to that level of those carbohydrates is fine. And it's just frustrating because, not frustrating, but it can be cumbersome to have to go to the lab, get your blood drawn in the morning, make sure you eat 100 grams of sugar, go back 2 hours right after you ate that and get it drawn again. So you have to get, multiple sticks in one day and kind of hang around the lab for 2 hours. So that's kind of, not something I frequently do, but I've had a few patients that have wanted to test it, and we've done that with them. And in extreme cases, or if we're getting wonky readings from the continuous glucose monitor or something that we need to double check, we can always do that too. Okay, this is from a blog post, and I'm actually going to share with you guys at the end, and I'll put the link on the email that I send out with the recording later this week of this doc talk. There is a company that makes a continuous glucose monitor. They're called Levels. It's more expensive. I haven't used that one, but they are very up and coming in the field, and they're doing a lot of research. And so they have a whole blog post about like what your optimal glucose ranges should be, and going way more in depth in this chart, but I stole this chart from there. So I'll give you guys that link at the end in the email. But this is kind of what we're looking for as far as optimal ranges. So this is just looking at that fasting blood glucose. And I denoted at the top whether we're looking at the functional range, which is what Dr. Brooke and I focus on as far as health optimization, or in the red is the standard range, which is what your PCP is reading off and telling you everything's fine. So for fasting glucose, the standard range, if you go to your doctor, they're going to tell you they want it under 100. If you are really tightening up the metabolic ship and you really want to be as healthy as you can and make sure your blood sugar is perfect, you'd want your fasting glucose to be between 72 and 85. So definitely, 15 to 20 points lower than what the standard labs are saying. Underneath that, they showed pre-meal or baseline glucose. This is pretty similar to what the functional range is for fasting. As you can see, 72 to 85 versus 72 to 90. And that's really just because if you're really hungry, your body, right before you eat, your body will sometimes call on the liver to release a little bit of glucose just to get you by until you have a meal. So it can go up to 90 there, but it shouldn't be overcompensating to a point where you're getting in the hundreds before a meal. That means you're waiting way too long to eat. And then this is kind of the most striking, is that they say a post-meal glucose peak, so checking your blood sugar probably like 30 to 60 minutes after you eat. The functional range says that it should stay under 110 with less than 30 milligrams per deciliter increase from pre-meal levels. So if you were at 90 when you tested it before the meal, you could technically go up to about 120, but they're saying that ideally it's better to stay under 110. Now, this is a very tight window. And to be honest with you, even when I did my continuous glucose monitor, I wasn't always in that window. Now, if I had a really, really healthy meal without a lot of carbs, I would stay in there and I would just have like a little blip. It would not be a high spike. But the standard range is under 140. And so if they're telling patients, oh, you know, under 140 is good, under 140 is good, for years and years and years, when really these patients could have been making small little tweaks to try and be, you know, under 120 or even 110, then they might not actually end up with diabetes in the long haul. The fourth line on here is the mean 24-hour glucose. So that's just if you were to average it all out. And you really still want to stay between 80 and 100, which theirs is a little higher. Theirs is 90 and 100. But these are the ideal levels to stay at. And like I said, excuse me, this chart is in the blog post that I'll give you with a lot more descriptions and information about it. And they go in and talk specifically about the pre-meal baseline and the fasting and the post-meal glucose peak so that you can, if this isn't enough information for you, you can look through that. I think it's a good, it's not a super long article. And I think it's good for everyone to read just to be able to wrap their mind around it. Like I said, this is a company that makes their own continuous glucose monitor, but I still feel like it's not like markety. They're not trying to sell you on theirs. They're just giving you really good information. And they're basically going through and saying, hey, we've been using this continuous glucose monitor through our company levels for X amount of years. This is what we found. You know, the healthiest of patients are staying within these ranges from our studies. And I think that that's important because a lot of the standard ranges over here on the right-hand side in the red are in reference to a quite unhealthy population. Any of your lab tests that you get from your traditional doctor, and it's not their fault, it's just how it is literally an average of everyone that lab has ever tested. So who's most of the time getting their labs wrong? People that are going to the doctor are not feeling the greatest. And so what functional medicine does is we tighten that window based on research and knowing that, hey, this might be the average window, but really if you want to be feeling your best and be sharp and be able to maintain weight loss and feeling good in your body, you need to be in between this window. So that's kind of the difference between the functional and the standard ranges. And obviously we want everyone that we're working with to strive to be in the functional range. And that might take some time. But we'll talk about a few things diet and lifestyle wise that can help you get there. Okay. So the first thing, there's multiple different slides for this because I wanted to make it big and talk more in depth about it. But lifestyle wise, exercise is imperative to good blood sugar regulation. Like I said, muscles are one of the biggest users of our glucose. So the more muscle that you have on your body, the more exercise that you're doing on a regular basis, the more glucose your body is sucking up and using. So you have a little more leniency there. You can actually have a little bit more carbs and glucose because you know you're going to burn some of them off and you're going to build muscles that will utilize that glucose on a daily basis for the rest of your life. So a really good thing that I talk to a lot of patients that are struggling with blood sugar stuff is to take walks after meals. I know that that can be sometimes hard. And especially if you're one of those people who needs to take a nap after they eat, you know, like a sign that your blood sugar is unregulated. But if you can, and it doesn't even need to be going on a walk. If you have a dog and you want to strategically plan your walks for after meals, that's great. Or just go by yourself and put on a little podcast. But you can even do things like moving around the house and doing laundry, folding laundry, cleaning the kitchen. All that stuff is using muscles and movement as opposed to just eating and then sitting on your buttocks. Okay. So little things like that can make a big difference after you eat to kind of like get up and get going. You don't need to go on like a crazy run with a full tummy, but just a gentle little walk. A lot of cultures do this just naturally. They will walk after dinner. Unfortunately, we miss the boat here in America and we do not typically do that. We get on the couch and turn on Netflix. So I encourage you, you know, if the kitchen needs a little tidying or you need to go mail something and there's, you know, a mailbox down the street that you want to go drop your mail off at, do it after you eat so that you're utilizing some of that glucose immediately. And then your body has to work less on getting it into all these cells and storing it because you're already kind of eating some of it up with that exercise. And then obviously daily exercise, or at least 4 to 5 times a week, walking or going to the gym and doing a little bit of weight resistance is good for many different things, including, you know, even just your mental health. The next lifestyle hack is going to be stress management. Imagine that. We talk about this in so many arenas too, and it's much easier said than done, but stress releases cortisol, which is one of our stress hormones from our adrenal glands. And cortisol is, historically, cortisol puts us in that fight or flight mode, you know, like we're running from a tiger or there's like some imminent threat to us. And so, yeah, it's going to mobilize sugars. It's going to bring blood sugar to levels that are higher than they are if you're just sitting there because your muscles might need it. You might need to run from something scary. And so if you're chronically stressed and your cortisol levels are high all the time because of a stressful work environment or a stressful family environment or not doing self-care and taking care of yourself, then your cortisol is going to be high and your blood sugar is going to be high in conjunction with that. And, you know, for short periods of time, that's okay. But if this is a chronic thing that's ongoing all the time and you can't bring yourself back to your center and get your stress under control, it's going to wreak havoc on your blood sugar. All right, the third lifestyle one is sleep. We know that lack of sleep causes insulin resistance. Bottom line, when you're not sleeping and allowing your body to repair overnight, your cells become less sensitive to insulin. And so when you eat a higher carb meal and produce insulin from the pancreas, the cells just don't care. They're not going to accept the insulin key and they're not going to uptake the glucose. And so then that leaves the glucose in your bloodstream. And I mentioned earlier that the cortisol from being in that chronically stressed phase will also raise blood sugar, but cortisol also rises when you're having deprivation from sleep. And so this is kind of along those same lines as far as the mechanism of action. But making sure that you're getting adequate sleep is not only good for a million other things, including your hormones, but it's really important for healthy blood sugar management and making sure that we're keeping those stress hormones where they should be and that they're only rising in acute situations where they should, and they're not staying high throughout a normal day just because we're stressed from work or this or that. Okay, next is diet. We talk about this a million times throughout the program, but protein-rich meals are imperative for having good blood sugar. Now, there's plenty of data on it too. I typically see blood sugar regulation in general gets harder as you age. Your cells become just like a little bit less sensitive to insulin in general. So if you test someone who even is really healthy and playing tennis every day and 75, sometimes they'll have higher insulin levels, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're insulin resistant, because with age, your insulin increases a little bit. However, if you're not having protein-rich meals, you're naturally substituting that protein for carbohydrate-laden food. That is literally the only other option out there, pretty much. And so you want to eat carbs, yes, and they give us quick energy. So a lot of times we crave those when our blood sugar goes low. But really what we should be doing is focusing more on the protein, because that will keep our blood sugar steady for a long time. It won't cause the same peaks and valleys, I guess you could say, that the sugar will, because protein doesn't get digested like that. It takes longer and it just doesn't produce those spikes or the changes like the carbohydrate meals do. You will still have a little bit of a curve, but it'll be a much gentler up and down than it would be if you had sugar with that. Or even, you know, white bread, white rice, pasta, those kind of things. And I eat carbs every day. I'm not anti-carb, but it's just more about combining it and feeling like you're getting adequate protein with those carbs. And you will feel a difference. Like you won't even be as hungry. Once you start eating enough protein and hitting your actual recommended protein goals, your next meal will come and you'll be like, oh my gosh, yeah, I guess I'm hungry, but it's not like I've been like looking at the clock for an hour or feeling like I need a bag of chips like I used to. And that also takes time too. You know, we're essentially changing the biochemistry in your body to go from using these quick bursts of carbohydrate, glucose energy into having more sustained energy from protein. So your body might feel a little bit weird for a little bit, but it will normalize. It's kind of like when people do keto and they switch to a lot of high fats as their main source of macronutrients instead of carbs. The people get like the keto flu, and it's literally because your body's biochemistry is switching from having to use carbs for energy into using fats, and you eventually get over that and your body normalizes. But it is a shift, you know, and if your body's been used to doing it for however many decades of eating higher carb meals, then it might take a month or so for you to feel completely normal. Okay, this is kind of my little blip about the herbal medicine. So occasionally, and I'll also put this link on there for you guys on the resources, I will recommend digestive bitters to people, and I'll put this brand because I like them. They're organic, they taste pretty good. I got them on Amazon, it's easy to get. There's a few different things behind this. So if we've ever given you digestive enzymes, or if you've ever taken digestive enzymes and that helped you feel less bloated or felt like you were more easily digesting your food, that probably means that you have some sort of deficiency in the production of those enzymes naturally, right? We produce tons of different enzymes from the pancreas, from the liver, from the gallbladder, from the small intestine to digest different kinds of foods. Your saliva even has some enzymes in it that starts to break down sugar and carbs as soon as food hits your mouth. So when we are having low digestive enzyme production and function, it feels a lot better when we take enzymes with our food. Now, if I'm going to go out to eat and eat a bunch of stuff that I don't typically ingest, sometimes I'll take digestive enzymes anyway, just to be safe and make sure that I'm digesting that. However, what you're doing with that is literally replacing your own enzymes. So you're not training the body, you're not teaching the body to produce its own enzymes, you're just giving it exogenous enzymes. So I like to use digestive bitters because what bitters do, they obviously have a bitter taste. Once they hit your tongue, your mouth will start watering. All of your digestive enzymes will start learning to be produced. And so it's actually, enzymes are still good, but they're kind of giving your body like the full thing. Whereas the digestive bitters are something that teach your body to produce its own enzymes. So it's a little bit more upstream, which I like. And I think that over time you can use less and less bitters and your body will still be producing those, which is nice because you're actually getting to the root of the problem as opposed to just taking the enzymes. So historically, a lot of people would do like digestifs, like the drinks that are a bitter alcohol. They'll have a little bit of that with dinner or before dinner, even salads before dinner. A lot of times we used to be eating really bitter greens. I feel like in America, our taste buds have kind of gone away from bitter and gone to more iceberg lettuce and romaine lettuce and butter lettuce, which is not super bitter. But eating things like endives or dandelion greens in a salad before you eat your meal can be very beneficial for getting some of those juices flowing and then being able to better digest your food and keep blood sugar levels stable, even if you do have a little bit more carbs. So I like to take these bitters. Another way to do that is with the bitter greens as a salad, or some people prefer apple cider vinegar. You're either an apple cider vinegar person or you're not. So I'm not going to force anyone to do this. But taking a little bit of apple cider vinegar before your meals, it also acts as a bitter and a little bit of a digestive enzyme too. It just depends. Like I like this because I can throw it in my purse, and even if I'm out and about, I can take a couple squirts of it. I sure as hell am not going to carry a bottle of apple cider vinegar with me. But if I'm at home and I'm going to have like a big steak or something, maybe I'll take a little swig of apple cider vinegar before just to help me too. You know, those are just options, and you don't have to do any of this. But I do find that in the research and in my clinical experience, people do really well with bitters because it's not only training the body to produce its own enzymes, but it also will help with the blood sugar aspect of things. And they are bitter, you know, maybe that'll start to retrain your taste buds to enjoy and crave a little bit more bitter things. There's been a lot of research on the vinegar specifically, and that when you take vinegar, excuse me, with a meal for 2 hours after that meal, people had a 20 to 40% reduction in blood sugar. So even if you have a salad and you can't stand bitter greens, but if you do some romaine or, you know, whatever, even spinach, and you put a little bit of vinegar on there as part of your dressing, that can support you too. That can help keep things low. So it doesn't need to be anything crazy or any special products, you know, just eat your salad first and have a little vinegar in the dressing, and that could do the trick. Another diet thing that we want to focus on is making sure that we really avoid eating late at night. Not only is this just really hard on your digestive system because you're going to sleep when you should be resting and relaxing, and your body's having to send all this blood to the intestines to digest. But it also can cause a spike in blood sugar as you're going to sleep, which can affect your ability to actually fall asleep. And then you might wake up a couple hours later because you're just like restless. And that's because your blood sugar tanked while you were asleep. So, some patients will wear the continuous glucose monitors and they'll notice that their blood sugar is getting pretty low at night. A lot of times we fix that by literally taking like a spoonful of almond butter before bed or something with a little bit of fat and protein. You don't need a whole nother meal or even a huge snack, but a little bit of something like that can help keep the blood sugar steady throughout the night and help you get a really good night's sleep, which in turn helps the next day's blood sugar stay steady too, right? It's a vicious cycle. If you're not getting good sleep and you're eating foods that are derailing your blood sugar, then it's just going to get worse and worse and worse over time. But you can also do the opposite and it'll get better and better over time. We know this, and I struggled even putting this in here because I don't want people to fear carbohydrates. And I feel like I'm okay doing this because you guys are all going through the program and you're learning that there is such a thing as good and bad carbohydrates. And so, you know, making sure that we're not having a lot of added sugars in our things, refined grains with a bunch of wheat flour or things like that, and white bread and white rice, and instead turning to whole foods like fruits and vegetables, and even whole grains and beans, to get more carbohydrates is going to be easier on the body, harder to break down, keep that little blip not from turning into a high spike of blood sugar. All right, I'm also going to share this with you. This is a Instagram account called The Glucose Goddess. If any of you guys have ever heard of her, she is not a doctor, but she is a researcher, and she has been wearing a continuous glucose monitor and tracking her blood sugar. And she wrote a book about it. She's obsessed with it. And she gives these really good visuals about how little tweaks can make a difference. So on the left-hand side, you see 2 different glucose spikes. And really what you want to do is stay in the green the whole time, but you also want to look at the area under the curve, which she highlights in black to kind of see how long it took you to get from where your baseline was originally back to the baseline and how high it spiked. So the first one, she compared an espresso with a chocolate croissant to an espresso with a ham croissant that has a little bit more protein in there. And her glucose spike was far less, and she got back into her baseline pretty quickly after, compared to almost double the amount of time when she had the chocolate croissant. So she still had the espresso, she still had the bread, but she just had ham in there instead of maybe a little bit of cheese, I can't see it, as opposed to chocolate, and it kept her blood sugar steady. So I'm showing these to you so that you know you don't have to only eat broccoli and chicken to have healthy blood sugar, right? It can be little tweaks like this that make a big difference. Here in the middle, she shows a veggie lasagna that really wrecked someone's blood sugar, and it was high for a super long time. They even had a second spike. But Below, they had the salad first, which kind of starts to get those digestive juices flowing and starts to slow the breakdown of the more carby noodles and vegetables and the lasagna. And they didn't have the second spike. The area under the curve, which much less, even smaller than what her first spike was in the top hand one. And so, you know, if that doesn't make you want to have a teeny little side salad before your meals, then I don't know what will. Put a little vinegar on there, a little apple cider vinegar, and you'll only be helping yourself. The third one, she compared toast with jam. So toast is carby, right? Regardless of what you're putting on it. But she compared toast with jam. She actually went up into her red range on this one. Her spike was above 30 points. And then on the bottom one, she had the same kind of toast, but she had it with unsweetened almond butter. And she barely spiked at all. I wouldn't even, that's like pretty steady all the way through. So, you know, it doesn't have to be some crazy diet reversal that you guys are doing. It can be little things like this. You guys should follow her if you have an Instagram. She's always putting interesting things up. And I think even just looking at this gives you guys ideas. So if you were seeing this on social media and kind of understanding the research behind it might motivate you a little bit. Any questions on any of this? Okay. This last slide is just a couple of resources. I'm going to put this all on the email that I send out with the recording. So just look for that. Dr. Mark Hyman, he's amazing. If you don't follow him, he is all into metabolic health. He is actually an MD who has turned functional. So he went to regular medical school, but now he practices like Dr. Brooke and I, and really optimization and prevention and reversal and things like that. He has a really good podcast I'll link. And then the one that's linked here in blue, highlighted in blue, that is the blog post that had the optimal blood sugar chart in there that I showed you guys. So I'll give you access to that. And then I'll put Glucose Goddess's handle on there if you want to follow her, and give you the link to these bitters that I use personally and really enjoy the taste of if you guys wanted to try that. Even if you're, you know, want to keep, I keep this on my desk here at work. If I'm home, maybe I'll use apple cider vinegar, or if I have a really big meal, digestive enzymes. But I like these at lunch for work because I'm not usually having like a super heavy, intense meal for lunch, but sometimes I am having more protein, and it's easier to help digest with those bitters and keep my blood sugar a little bit steady throughout the day. So I'll give you guys access to all that stuff because I know I made mention of it. And yeah, that's kind of all I have for you today. Do you guys have any questions about that? Any concerns? Do you want to know more information? Were you surprised by any of that?
I thought that was great. You know, as somebody who's been struggling back and forth with this and really not getting guidance from my internist, I was really glad to understand this on a more scientific level. Yeah. And I really appreciated the small changes that you were talking about at the end.
Yeah. And, you know, there's a couple things that I'm really into, I would say. And diabetes and blood sugar regulation is one of them because it's in my family. And I'm like, I don't want to end up like this. What can I do? Breast cancer is another. My mother had breast cancer when she was 37. Luckily, she's completely healthy and in remission. But those are two things that I have been researching for years, and I get into the nitty gritty. And it's amazing how big of a difference the small changes can make. So I just want you guys to be encouraged by that and not think that, like I said, you don't have to just eat chicken and broccoli for your blood sugar to be healthy. And if you guys are interested in doing a continuous glucose monitor, or if that's something that you want to try, just reach out to me in the portal. I can prescribe it to you. Like I said, the first one is free. You just have to, I'll send you the instructions, but you have to go on and do like a free voucher basically. And then you just show that to the Walgreens pharmacist and they give it to you for free. And then I think I've had 1 or 2 patients that did more than the 14 days, and I swear it was only like $75. So that's still a pretty good deal if you wanted to get another one or another couple just to kind of track things and see how some of those little tweaks and changes can make a difference. I think it's good for like the first 3 to 5 days to kind of eat how you're normally eating so that you can see how your blood sugar is reacting, and then start to implement some of these changes we talked about to see how that corrects it, if it does. And there's a million other things, like I said, with herbs and different stuff that I didn't talk about today. But, you know, I always like to start with the easiest, cheapest, low hanging fruit, because why the heck not? And then later, if we need to move into something that's higher intervention, there's loads of other things in our toolbox, but 85% of the time, once we do this stuff, people notice a difference and they feel better.
Fantastic. Thank you. I have to run because I have a patient, but
no worries. No worries. I'll send this out later this week. I might not get to it till Thursday because this week's really busy. But it'll have all those resources for you guys on there. Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Bye, Eve. Bye, Karen.